Hello, my name is Rain and welcome to my channel where I discuss Fantasy Formula 1. This video is going to be a very simple one. Should you Limitless or Wildcard in China? When should you Limitless or Wildcard in China? And what should your Limitless or Wildcard team look like in China? Without further ado, let's get right into it, starting with the Limitless. So there are a few things you need to consider if you are considering of using the Limitless, if that made any sense whatsoever. The first thing is your team already good? And what I mean by this is that you need to have had a decent weekend in Australia in order to consider the Limitless. And the reason for that is because after you use the Limitless chip, your team reverts back to what it was the prior weekend once the weekend has concluded. So if you use your Limitless in China, come Japan or after the Chinese Grand Prix has concluded, your team will revert back to what it was in Australia. So if you have a bad team, your team's gonna go back to that bad team. It doesn't matter if you've made transfers before activating the Limitless, the team reverts back to what it was the weekend before. And the problem with that is your budget. If you have all of these rookies that DNF'd, or all of those assets that DNF'd, all those assets that got negative points at a big negative price decrease, they are very likely to decrease in price again after China. And if you have those assets in the back behind your Limitless, you're going to keep losing budget, meaning that you later on in the season are going to be way behind everyone. And the Limitless, the value of the Limitless in terms of points that you get for using it in China is not going to be enough of an upside come later in the season because your team behind the Limitless was so bad. So what is a good team then that I would consider using the Limitless on? Well, did you gain budget in Australia? If your budget overall went up in Australia, it's very likely to go up again. So if that was the case, then definitely consider the Limitless. If you want to know if your budget went up, you just go into your team, click X and remove all the assets, and you can see what your total team budget cap is. If it's above 100 million, you gained budget in Australia. The other thing is, do you have the assets that will increase in value? Maybe your budget didn't increase or decrease, but do you have those big assets that actually performed really well in Australia? I'm talking Nico Hülkenberg, I'm talking Lance Stroll, I'm talking Lando Norris. Do you have those assets? If you do, you can definitely consider using the Limitless. And then the last thing is there nothing that you need to fix, right? Eating one big budget loss for a Gabriel Bortoleto or a Isaac Hadjar, for example, is completely okay. But do you have multiple things that you need to fix? Do you have both Sainz, Alonso, Hadjar, Bortoleto? Do you have all of these assets in your team, which I've seen people have? Then you definitely should not use the Limitless. It's better than to consider the Wildcard, which we will be discussing after this. Or to just use your regular transfers if you don't want to waste the wildcard just yet. Use your regular transfers, fix your team for China, and just use the Limitless in one of the future race weekends. Then, if your team clicks all of these boxes, you have a good team in the back. Should you use the Limitless? Well, it still depends. I'm going to be posting a massive, full deep dive into the maths Limitless guide video when I get back to Sweden. I'm still in Australia after the season opener. But essentially all you need to know for now is that you need the Limitless to look good after the sprint qualifying. So the drivers that you would want on a Limitless, you need them to be in good positions to score points in the sprint, because since it's a sprint weekend in China, you can watch the sprint qualifying and then make your F1 fantasy decisions. The deadline is not until before the sprint race, which is the first session of the weekend that scores points in F1 fantasy. You can then look at sprint qualifying and then assess if a team looks good or not. And if a team looks good, I would argue, is when one of those premium assets that you would want on a Limitless that can perform really well in the race actually underperforms in the sprint qualifying, so they can gain a lot of positions and overtakes in a sprint race. Because you don't get that many points for a sprint. You only get 8 points for a win, for example. Meanwhile, if you start P20 and go to P15, 5 overtakes, 5 positions gained, that's 10 points. That's more than the person who won the sprint got, right? That's the basis of the maths. So look at the sprint qualifying. Are the assets that you want to pick up on your Limitless underperforming, or are they P1, P2, P3, P4, P5 in the sprint qualifying? That's what you should assess in terms of using the Limitless or not, combined with if your team in the back in the back, if you understand what I mean, is good enough. So with that said, what's a good Limitless team? This here is my team 2, which I'm considering using the Limitless chip on. I've not decided on that fact yet, but I do think if you're limitlessing, the 4 must-have assets on your team, non-negotiable, no matter how they perform in sprint qualifying. I think it's Norris, Piastri, Verstappen, and McLaren. When you are looking at a Limitless team, you don't care about budget, because your budget is your team in the back that you had prior to Limitlessing, meaning that Piastri decreasing in price in Australia has no impact whatsoever. You're just trying to get the assets that score the most points. And I think Norris, Piastri, Verstappen, and McLaren are the must-have assets. Your final 3 picks, the 2 final drivers and the last constructor, are a bit more flexible, and that's sort of where this sprint qualifying check comes in. Did Russell underperform? Did Kimi Antonelli underperform? Did Hamilton underperform? Did Leclerc underperform? And those are the drivers that you pick. I think going for something like a triple Ferrari here is totally fine. I think Ferrari should be able to perform better than they did in Australia, especially if 1 or 2 of Leclerc and Hamilton underperform in the sprint qualifying. I think definitely they are options. Again, Kimi Antonelli could be really good. Do you trust Red Bull Racing with Liam Lawson if Liam Lawson performs badly? I mean, you could definitely go for a triple Red Bull in here. I think it's a bit more risky because we haven't seen Liam Lawson perform well in the Red Bull just yet. But I mean, it's certainly an option if Liam Lawson was to qualify, go out in sprint quali 1. Like he did in Australia. If he does that though, do you think he's going to be able to do some overtakes and actually actually gain some places in the sprint race? Maybe, maybe not. I don't think that personally I would trust it. But ultimately, these 3 are completely flexible. I could also see myself going for a triple Mercedes build, completely ignore Ferrari. If Ferrari qualifies, like P6, P7, those are really not high scoring positions in the sprint, whereas like a George Russell from P3 and a Kimi Antonelli from P16 looks way, way, way better, as we saw with their point score in Australia. So that's my assessment of the Limitless. I think the 4 assets you see in front of you right here are the must-haves. The final 3 flexible depending on what happens in sprint qualifying and how the teams look over the course of the weekend. But ultimately, this is what I would do if you use the Limitless chip, combined with what I talked about previously about your team in the back being good enough. If your team isn't good enough, then maybe you should consider using the Wildcard. Let's go and check what I think you need to do to Wildcard. So, the Wildcard then. Infinite transfers, remade your team. It's super early in the season. Should we burn this chip already? I think there's a lot of merit to using the Wildcard depending on what your team looks like. I think the first thing you should look at is, do you have more than 2 assets guaranteed to drop in price in China? And what I mean by guaranteed is something I'm going to show you later, but basically if you want to know how the budget building system, how the price increase and decrease system works in F1 Fantasy 2025, go and watch my budget build strategy video. I'll put the link in the description, or you can just go to my channel and find it there. And while you're there, you might as well like and subscribe. But if you don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of how it actually works, all you need to know is that each asset, each driver, each constructor needs to reach a certain point score based on their points per million, based on like how much they actually cost. And if they reach that, they will increase or decrease in price. And I'm going to show you on the next slide what each driver and each constructor needs to score in China to increase in price. And why do we care about this? Well, all of these drivers that DNF'd in Australia are very likely to decrease the maximum again unless they have amazing races. So for that reason, if you don't want to get hit with your budget even further, you might consider wildcarding if you can't get rid of all those assets with free transfers. The next thing is, even if you do eat the budget loss, say you keep a Gabriel Bortoleto in your team, for example, who's likely to decrease 0.6 million again, do you still not have a team likely to score high? I'm talking in terms of points. Sometimes your team, you just have to take the budget drop. You can't do anything about it. You have other assets you need to fix. But if your team looks bad points-wise as well, then definitely consider the wildcard. And then the last thing is, if you have McLaren and Williams, which I know is a really popular constructor pairing, I do not think you should wildcard, because I think even if you have really bad drivers in there, I think it's somewhat salvageable, because I'm going to show you my preferred wildcard team later, and the constructor duo that I do think is the best for wildcarding will be a McLaren Williams build. So if you already have that, I do think that the drivers that you're going to have, even if you have Sainz, Alonso, Hadjar, and Bortoleto, who all DNF'd, I do think it's going to be salvageable with free transfers or with 1 point hit. So maybe then you don't wildcard. But if you're on any other strategy and you have multiple drivers that dropped in price and that are likely to decrease in price further, I think you should consider the wildcard. Let's look at what each driver needs to actually score to increase in price, right? And the reason we do this is because a lot of our teams, a lot of the strategy over the course of the season does involve budget building and your team value increasing so you can pick more expensive drivers. And if your drivers drop off now, when you have them, your budget gets hit and then other people can swoop in and buy them later. And I know it's very, very tiny here. I hope you can see it. But essentially what this is what each driver needs to score to increase in price, right? One thing that's incorrect in this one, this is just one I found on Twitter. I don't know who made it initially, but I stole it from Fantasy Formula Hub Rob. Thank you for that. It's just incorrect here on the good tier for the, less than 20. It should be plus 0.3 million, but ignore that. Essentially, great, good, poor, terrible. This is the different price increases and decreases, and this is what the driver needs to score. So let's look at Sainz. I think Sainz is a fantastic example of this. Sainz, I think points-wise, he's a really good asset to pick on a wild card because, Williams look pretty fast. I think Sainz can score decently well. But if you pick Sainz in China, he needs to score for a great increase, meaning he increases 0.6 million. He needs to score over 34 points. And I don't think that's going to happen. Take Albon, for example. Amazing race in Australia. He did not score that many. And he was behind Yuki Tsunoda the entire time until VCarb messed up his strategy. Ferrari also messed up strategy. Piastri spun out. That's a lot of drivers that I think would have finished above Albon if the Australian Grand Prix hadn't been that crazy. So I think Albon more than likely would have been on a P8, P9 position if there wasn't that much crazy stuff going on in front of him. And in that case, he would have been nowhere close to reaching 34 points. And even if you think, okay, he's not going to reach 34 points, but he's probably going to get like 20 points. Well, to even avoid decreasing the maximum, Sainz needs to score over 26 points. He needs to score 27 points or higher to just avoid a 0.6 million drop. And a good point score for an asset of Sainz's price, I think, is between 15 and 20 million. 15 and 20 points, sorry. I think if Sainz gets 18 points in a race weekend, you're super happy about that. But even in that case, he's going to decrease the maximum. So therefore, I think you need to sell Sainz if you have him. I think you need to downgrade him, maybe to an Albon, who, by comparison, because he had such a good Australian Grand Prix, to increase the maximum, he can score -1 point. Meaning Albon over a sprint weekend can score -1 point and still increase the maximum price. Obviously, you would rather your assets actually get points, but who's to say Albon is not going to be the one scoring 15 points and Sainz scores 12? For that reason, I think Albon is an infinitely better asset than Sainz on the wildcard. I'm not saying Sainz is bad for points. I'm not saying Sainz isn't going to be amazing in the future, but for the Chinese Grand Prix in specific, for the Chinese Grand Prix specifically, I do not think you pick Sainz under any circumstances above Alex Albon. Then once his DNF, once Sainz's, once Alonso's, once all of the rookies' DNFs are gone in the how this is calculated, because it's over a 3-race average now, beyond Japan, once Sainz has decreased in price multiple times, then you can then make a transfer, a free transfer, to get Sainz in if he's had a decent Chinese Grand Prix, a decent Japanese Grand Prix. So you can then look going down the line and see what each of the assets need to score. And I'm not gonna, ask you to sit here and squint your eyes. I'm just gonna move to the next one. These are what I would consider the great, decent, and terrible picks. This is, again, only for budget, but because I think budget is such a valuable thing on the wildcard, I think if you're using the wildcard, you need to make the most of it. I don't think you should get someone like a Bortoleto in there, even if you can afford to upgrade something else because of it, because when you do so, you don't get the maximum value out of the wildcard, which would be to try and grab all of these price increases while you can predict them. So for this, again, Liam Lawson could definitely have a good, decent point score, but he needs to have such a high score to actually increase a lot in price. I think he's a terrible pick. So let's go through them. I think the great picks are Norris, Verstappen, Russell, Antonelli, Albon, Stroll, Ocon, Hulkenberg, and the great constructors, McLaren, Ferrari, Red Bull, Mercedes, Williams, and Haas. I think all of those picks in the great picks, if they avoid a DNF, just avoid it. They don't need to have a good weekend at all. They just need to get 3-4 points, like nothing major, just avoid the DNF. They're going to increase in price, the maximum guaranteed. That's how good they are. The decent picks still need to have a good weekend, right? I think Hamilton needs to score something like 25 points to increase the maximum. It's a lot, but it's definitely possible in a sprint weekend for Hamilton to increase by that much. Leclerc, Piastri, similar story. Gasly, I think Gasly needs something like 13 points to increase the maximum, which could definitely happen. They just don't have that massive underlying negative score from the previous weekend that's hurting their chances to increase in this week. They just need to have a good Chinese Grand Prix. So you can definitely still pick Leclerc, Hamilton, Piastri, Gasly, Tsunoda, and Behrman into your wildcard teams. But for the terrible picks, I would never pick them on a wildcard. Not one of them, not in a single draft. Even if going for a Hadjar or a Bertoletto and eating them 0.6 decrease allows you to upgrade a different asset to something else, I still think you don't do it, because at that point, if you're still eating that 0.6 drop, you might as well just save your team with free transfers and not using the wildcard, because if you're going to use the wildcard, you should use it to its maximum potential. What's its maximum potential? Let's go and check it on one of my personal teams that performed terribly at the Australian Grand Prix. So look at this monstrosity of a team, right? This was my budget building team, my team 3 in Australia. Piastri, Leclerc, Sainz, Albon, Hadjar, Alpine, and Racing Bulls. I had both of the terrible constructors that got negative points. Sainz DNF, Hadjar DNF, Leclerc had a bad race, Piastri had a bad race. Really the only asset to increase in price was Alex Albon. And if we check my budget on my budget building team, it's 97.6 million. I lost 2.4 million in value. So this team is 100% going to be wildcarding because the team is that terrible. And these are the sort of the two builds I think you can go for. The first one I'm going to show you is the risky one. So it's not my favorite, but I think it's what I will do on this team because it's a budget building team. And that is going for 2 cheap constructors. The reason for that is, again, I think constructors are very likely to rise in price and they can increase 0.6 million in price. You're going to not get as many points with this team, but I think this is probably what I would build if I would 100% focus on budget building and just get some point, like, you know, get the points are extra on the side. I would go for Williams and Aston Martin. I know Aston Martin was just considered a decent pick, but considering Haas is only 0.3 million cheaper, Aston Martin just decreased 0.6 million in price. Aston Martin just needs to get a couple of points on the board to not decrease further. Just avoid the DNF and they're fine. So I think Aston Martin plus Williams is a good combo for budget building, but you can definitely go for Haas here as well on Aston Martin. Then for the drivers, because you've picked 2 super cheap constructors, you can now, even with a terrible budget of 97.6 million that I had, you can fit in all of the overperforming drivers. And what I mean by that are these drivers that I think are almost guaranteed to increase the price. I mean, Lando Norris could literally DNF in both the sprint race and the feature race and still increase the maximum price. That's how crazy good they were. Hulkenberg can also eat a DNF and still be relatively fine on one of the sessions. Antonelli can eat a DNF in either the sprint or the main race. Again, I'm losing points, but for budget building purposes, I think this is the sort of team you build, and this team is super cheap. If you had an even worse weekend than the team I just showed you, my budget building team, which by the way scored like negative 12 points, all you gotta do here is like downgrade Lance Stroll to someone like an Ocon, right? Esteban Ocon is totally fine asset to pick. Or even further, if you had an even worse week, you can just go for a Behrman, which is still a decent asset. I think this is the best budget building team you can go for currently. I don't think it's the best team that's going to score you a lot of points. I'm going to show you that in a second. But this is something I'm going to go for on this experimental budget building team that had a horror show in Australia. But if you're actually looking to either wildcard and you have a higher budget than what I have on this team, and you actually want to take it a bit seriously and get a lot of points as well, and actually build for the future and not just, you know, full balls to the walls budget building, I'm going to show you that in a second with a new team, because I am going to be starting a new account just to test out starting from the second weekend of the year, going into it with 0 points, 100 million in the budget. All three of my teams on my main account, which I'm going to be following throughout the year on my team selection, all three of them dropped over 1 million in budget. So I just want to see what I can do on a new account with 0 points starting at 100 million for the second race, and if that can actually catch up and go past my other teams to see how strong budget building actually was. So it's more of an experiment than anything else. I'm going to show you what I think you should do if you're wildcarding with something like a budget of 99 million. So this is then on my new account with 100 million in the bank. Since I'm starting a new account, it's essentially like using a wildcard, and the team I would go for is McLaren plus Williams. McLaren is going to increase 0.3 million every single race. Even if they have a DNF, they're going to increase 0.3 million every single race. Williams, again, even though with the Carlos Sainz DNF, I think they are in a very good position to increase in price the coming races, and their lower price allows you to get some of those more expensive assets and avoid the rookies, the cheap rookies that are going to keep falling over the next two races. And then the problem with McLaren as a constructor is that you can't fit in Norris alongside them, but that's where someone like a Oscar Piastri comes in. Now, Oscar Piastri, I think, is a really decent asset. He obviously decreased in price in Australia, but he didn't have a massive negative score, meaning that he only needs to score, I think it was 18 points. I can't remember exactly now, but you can just go back in the video and watch the graph. Something like 18 points to increase in price, and that he can definitely reach that over a sprint weekend. If he gets P2 in the sprint, P2 in the race, still gets a good solid 2x score. So I would pick something like Oscar Piastri to be my 2x of choice. Obviously, again, with McLaren in there, you can't fit Kimi Antonelli. I think Kimi Antonelli is a decent 2x choice if you want to go for him, but I would rather go for Piastri for the points. I think going for Kimi Antonelli is more of the budget building route and a bit more of a risky move. This leaves 34 million in the bank if you have 100 million. And then let's just start picking the lower price drivers that overperformed. We have Alexander Albon, we have Lance Stroll, we have Nico Hülkenberg, and that leaves 5.8 million. And this is where we run into a problem, because now you need to pick Isaac Hadjar or Gabriel Bortoleto, so you cannot fit in this team with that budget. And I think that's the issue. I would not go for this team because Bortoleto is going to decrease 0.6 million again. Isaac Hadjar is going to decrease 0.6 million again, and I'm just not sure that's the best way to use the wild card. Instead, what I would do is to try and fit in something like a Behrman or an Ocon into this team. What you can do, let's take, for example, Lance Stroll out of the team, pick Esteban Ocon and Oliver Behrman. Again, you don't have Lance Stroll, that's totally fine. Maybe he's going to crash in China and suddenly he's a bad option. Haas don't look great, I know, but Behrman just needs to get a couple of points on the board. Ocon, I think, just needs basically to avoid the DNF to increase in price. So I think this is a perfectly fine team. Again, you can afford this team with a budget of 99.1 million. If you're like me on my main team, which is at like 98.4, 98.5, 98.6, and you have lost over 1 million in budget and you can't afford this, I think just going without Alex Albon is completely fine because you can fit good enough assets in there. What I would pick then is Yuki Tsunoda. Yuki Tsunoda still needs to have a decent Chinese Grand Prix to increase in price. To have a good increase in price. But then again, after China, you have Japan, and that's his home race. If he does well there, he can be in contention for driver of the day. And he had a really, really good race until V-Carb messed up the strategy for him. So I think Tsunoda is a perfectly fine option. Again, it's one of those decent options that I talked about, that it can definitely increase in price and be a good asset. The problem is that they just need to have a decent Chinese Grand Prix to actually do that. But I think going for Yuki Tsunoda over Alex Albon allows you to fit a team with the budget. And then you can just go for Lance Stroll and Esteban Ocon in there, no problem. That leaves 1.9 million in the bank for someone with 100 million. So as long as you're 98.1 million or above, you can fit in this team. If you don't like Yuki Tsunoda and want to stretch it a bit further, you could get rid of Ocon, go for Pierre Gasly at 11.2, which similarly to Yuki Tsunoda just needs to have a decent weekend in China, and then go for Oliver Behrman in there, which again only needs a decent weekend. That's 1.1 million in the bank, meaning you can reach this team on 98.9 million. But these are the sort of wildcard teams that I would try to slot in. I would avoid Jack Doohan, Isaac Hadjar, Bortoleto, Alonso, Carlos Sainz as much as possible. Right now, I don't know which one I prefer. Again, I'm probably going to look at the sprint qualifying to see which combination of these drivers are actually the best. You know, if both the Haas's are still super slow starting from the back, I think something like this could be really powerful, where you do get Alexander Albon in there to combo with the Williams. So I don't think that's a bad shout at all. I think really the must-have asset on your wildcard is Nico Hülkenberg. He's super cheap at 7 million. He's almost guaranteed to increase in price. Even if he DNFs in one of the 2 sessions this week, he's likely going to increase in price as long as he gets like a 2-pointer in the other one. So Nico Hülkenberg is the one asset that's in all of my wildcard teams right now. The other ones move in and out, but you can see the ones I'm focusing on. Alex Albon, if I can stretch the budget to him. If not, I can settle for a Yuki Tsunoda. Lance Stroll, I think it's good, as well as Oliver Behrman if you need that cheap asset. I think Oliver Behrman is as low as you go. But that's it for this video. Let me know what you think of the wildcard team. Is this something you would be willing to go for? Or are you going to try something completely different? Are you going to go for the 2 premium constructor build that a lot of us are on? I think if you do so, that's totally valid. The problem with that build, in my opinion, is that in that case, you kind of have to have one of the Hadjars and Bortoletos. And I do think the double constructor build, the double premium constructor build, as you say, with like McLaren plus Mercedes, or McLaren or Mercedes plus Ferrari, I think those teams are going to be very good once we're past this run of 3 races, where these cheap assets are going to decrease in price every week, right? Once we get past Japan, we can definitely get to a point in the season, if Hadjar, Bortoleto have had a decent China and a decent Japan, where we're gonna want to have them, make the switch to them, and then use that money to upgrade Williams or you know, change McLaren Williams to something else. But I think that's something that's gonna come later on in the season, once we get past this disastrous F1 fantasy, F1 fantasy weekend that was Australia. So something like this is my wildcard team of choice. Thank you so much for watching this video. My team selection video will be out later in the week, maybe tomorrow. For now, subscribe if you haven't. I'm trying to reach 2K subscribers. Like the video, and leave me a comment what you think the best wildcard team is if you disagree with my selection. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.